Well, the Finance Minister, Pravin Gordhan, we can still say that, delivered a pragmatic medium-term budget policy statement in Cape Town on Wednesday. He struck to the expenditure ceiling. He emphasised just how tough 2017 was going to be. But he did say if we do the right things, we could move the primary balance on the main budgets into a surplus. And he did touch on state-owned entities, or at least SAA. But was it enough to appease ratings agencies? And has he earned us another reprieve come December? This is the MoneyMakers. I'm Bruce Whitfield. Tonight, I'm joined by Nazmeera Moola, the co-head of fixed income at Investec Asset Management, to talk about the medium-term budget policy statement and whether or not it did enough to set the wolves back to their slumber. Nazmeera Moola, good to have you with us this evening on the MoneyMakers. Did the Finance Minister do well enough?
I think the Finance Minister did a very good job in very difficult circumstances.
Okay, very good job in difficult circumstances. Those difficult circumstances become our difficult circumstances, of course, come 2017. Just how bad is the tax burden going to be? He was talking about a 43 billion rand extra tax burden over the next 2 years. That suggests an increase in in tax rates, and it suggests perhaps increases in fuel levies, sin taxes, and of course the hurried imposition perhaps of a sugar tax.
Next year, in the February budget, they had been penciling in a 15 billion rand increase in taxes for the year that starts 1st April 2017. What they added yesterday was another 13 billion rand. So next year, they're looking to raise 28 billion rand, which is quite a bit.
How does that get raised in a way that doesn't kill the golden goose?
Well, I think what they're most likely to do is what you alluded to, is do a portfolio of tax measures that moves the income tax brackets up a little bit, that do sugar tax, though that's not likely to raise much in the way of revenues, and a fuel levy potentially. I think they're very cautious about doing anything that's going to kill growth.
You also want to encourage taxpayers to be compliant, and loading taxes on the rich, while incredibly populist, or the wealthier end of South Africa, while incredibly populist, just gets tax advisors rich, doesn't it?
There is that risk, and there is a concern that tax morality in South Africa is declining, that the willingness to pay taxes is falling. Personally, I think it's less about pushing the rates up too much and more about making sure that our tax revenues are spent efficiently and appropriately. If we start to feel that we're getting value for our taxes, our willingness to pay actually goes up.
There was some very strong commentary around the National Procurement Office, and of course Mr. Brown, who runs that procurement office, has found all kinds of nasties while he's been there for the last 3 years. And it is, why pay twice the price or 50% more for a pencil if you don't need to do so? It is about managing those costs, publicising that you're managing those costs, and therefore taking away the disincentive which many people feel in the way of the e-tolls, for example, which could have been the start of some kind of tax revolt. There are people in social media calling for that sort of activity. It would be destructive, wouldn't it?
I think it would be very destructive, and I think there's a large portion of our expenditure which is channeled appropriately. So if we think about something as basic as social welfare grants, there are millions of people in South Africa that benefit from this. The social welfare grants to children, there have been studies done which show that families in income groups at the bottom end of the spectrum who receive social welfare grants have children that are taller, that have better school grades 3 or 4 years later than families that didn't receive the grants. So there are programs that are hugely beneficial that are funded by taxes. So we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
We most certainly don't, but it does come to responsible expenditure, and it comes to also responsible leadership in terms of how the orchestra that is perhaps South Africa's cabinet is pulled together. The conductor of that audience did nod off during the medium-term budget policy statement yesterday, which was somewhat concerning. But Pravin Gordhan himself seems to be determined, despite all of the other pressures that he faces, to take a very central leadership role.
I think leadership is what's missing, because what is very clear to me is that while the finance minister may have done a good job with the budget yesterday, given the constraints he faces, and hopefully maybe this is enough for us to avoid a ratings downgrade from S&P in December, this doesn't solve the problem in the long term. The only way S&P removes the negative watch on South Africa's credit rating is if we get growth going. And in order to get growth going, it's not about the finance minister or the national treasury. It's about all the other departments in government making the changes necessary, the structural adjustments necessary to get growth going.
Now, some would say the corporate sector is sitting on nearly a trillion rand, I beg your pardon, of lazy capital. It's sitting on balance sheets. It's not being applied because the corporate sector lacks the confidence, and perhaps all of us lack the confidence, to make long-term investments in a society which is under extreme duress. How would you see that confidence restored to a point where many more of us would feel confident to make those investments?
Well, the first step is you need political stability. We can't be having a discussion on who's going to be the finance minister next week. That needs to be taken out of the equation completely. So that's step one. Step two is these more structural regulatory changes that I'm alluding to. We already have seen the labour market much more functional this year than we saw it last year. So that's already progress. But we need further progress in that area. We need further progress in tourism and visas. There's a whole list of things that need to be done, but those are the measures that need to be implemented to solve the problem and to restore confidence and get businesses investing.
I appreciate that it's not a one-step solution. If it was, we could just simply flick a button and everything would be sorted out. But what is the one fundamental issue in South Africa right now that if you as Nazmeera Moola could flick a switch, what is the one thing that you would flick in order to restore confidence?
I'd stop the political infighting. It's almost impossible. But as you say, in the imaginary world that you describe, I would take away the question of who's going to be finance minister from the entire discussion.
I mean, it is actually that simple, and that's what's so terrifying about the continuous uncertainty around South Africa. Is Standard & Poor's the scariest of the ratings agencies from a South African perspective right now?
Only because they have us at the lowest current rating. So they have us at the lowest investment grade rating, BBB-, and they have us on a negative watch. Fitch has us on BBB-, but a stable watch, so there's every risk that they move to negative in December. Moody's has us 2 notches above the sub-investment grade at BBB flat, or the equivalent of BBB flat.
I mean, the odds of a December downgrade feel more remote than a downgrade in June felt ahead of the time as we got our ducks in a row. I mean, is it something as simple as the security of the finance minister as to whether or not we get the downgrade from Standard & Poor's?
There were 3 things Standard & Poor's mentioned in June as 3 things that they'd be watching, and if any of those occurred, they would look to downgrade in either December or one of the meetings next year. And those were if the growth outlook did not improve. And the growth outlook has improved somewhat since June. You think about the Reserve Bank upgrading their growth forecast in September for the first time in years. The second was if there was an erosion of the institutional strength of South Africa that resulted in a deterioration in the fiscal outlook, and that hasn't happened. So far, that seems to be holding together. And the third is that if there was a deterioration in the financial performance of riskier government entities that resulted in their debt being consolidated into the national government debt. And so far, that hasn't happened either. So it's not that as if one of the triggers that S&P mentioned has been pulled since June.
How much did it bother you that we didn't talk about policy reform and we didn't talk about state-owned enterprises other than a quick, slightly snide remark about SAA and whether or not the finance minister actually runs it in the medium-term budget policy statement? Those are also 2 areas which are of concern.
It's not the medium-term budget policy statement's place to talk about structural reforms and how we get growth going. What it did have was the impact on the budget of risk scenarios. So if GDP growth contracted by 2% next year, what would the budget look like? But this is a budget. It's not South Africa's grand economic plan. And that's why it comes back to your earlier point, Bruce. It's about getting cohesion. It's about getting leadership. It's about getting the different departments to work together to get growth going overall. And that's a message we've seen from the finance minister. We've seen from the Reserve Bank governor. Now, it's not about the macro policy tools of fiscal policy and monetary policy. It's about everything else.
Right, I've got you on that one. Before I let you go this evening, Nazmeera Moola, I do need to ask you about your other job. In the last couple of months, you've been asked and accepted to a seat on the board of SAA. Not nearly as poisoned a chalice, perhaps, as the board of the SABC, but how are things going in the boardroom at South African Airways?
Bruce, I think that it's important at this point in time for everyone that can to contribute however they can. And if my participation at SAA does that, that's why I accepted. And so far, it's been a very constructive engagement. There's a lot of work to be done. The minister is very clear that he expects the board to take up all those responsibilities, and so we're working hard.
We're working hard. Are we going to see financial progress in the way in which the airline is run within the next 12 months? I mean, what are the sort of the board deadlines that you've set yourselves?
I think we're still in the planning stage, but that would be very much part of what the minister, who is the shareholder representative, the finance minister is the shareholder representative for SAA, and it is what he would expect.
And is there any chance of a public-private partnership? I mean, is it on the table in the boardroom at all? The president did say this week that he wasn't keen to sell the national airline, but he could sell a bit of it, couldn't he? The wings and the tail, perhaps?
Bruce, it's still early days to get into those discussions.
Okay. Nazmeera Moola, thank you so much for joining us this evening. The co-head of fixed income at Investec Asset Management, with her assessment of the medium-term budget policy statement and just a small insight into the early stage, we hope, turnaround of SAA under a huge amount of pressure, of course, losing more than 5 billion 2 years ago, about 1.5 billion last year. And the job of the board of SAA is going to be to ensure that operational efficiencies return to the national carrier. More Moneymakers next time on your TV, but until then, have yourselves a very good evening. Bye-bye.